load, and training load can be looked at in a variety of factors. This is a really big technical definition of what training load is, but essentially training load is anything that puts stress on our system physically and our whole system, and it's the load that is applied to it over a variety of times. And so you don't have to look at that whole definition, but I like to look at it in a couple of different ways. The first thing is with training load, it's a factor that can be used in a positive sense, which most of us use it for, to improve our strength and fitness. And this kind of figure here shows what we'd like to typically happen is you do a training session or a gym session. Directly after that load, you have a short-term reduction in your capacity, but the body adapts during recovery, and then you get an adaptation and you get increased capacity. And if you apply that over time, we get increasing capacity, and that's how we improve our fitness or improve our strength or performance, right? And that's what we'd love to happen all the time, right? What can happen sometimes if we don't recover well enough, or we're doing load that's excessive to what our body could handle, is rather than getting the recovery that we would like, we actually see that you get suboptimal recovery, and over time our performance or our capacity is reduced, and that maybe leads to when we're susceptible to injury or other side of things. So everyone knows that monitoring how much we're doing is important, and I've highlighted load spike here because probably the thing we're looking for with training load, and I'm going to show you three kind of key studies and bits that we should look at around training load, but one of the key things we want to keep an eye on is that big increase in training load relative to our normal capacity level, which we term a load spike. And from my perspective as a health professional and a running physio is to go, that's the stuff I often see when runners come in when they're injured, is if we break down their training profile, there's usually an element of something's changed with their loading. And it's either a load spike relative to their baseline loading, or it is underloading potentially, which has also been shown to be a factor if we're not doing enough to maintain our fitness or our baseline. And so there's three kind of things that I think are important based off really strong modern evidence. One of them is around our long run distance. And this is a really modern, recent study that has done the rounds a lot online for good reason, because there's a lot of data to back this up. And what they found is that rather than just looking at our weekly training, this study looked at the long run distance that runners did over the course of a month. And they found that if you compared the run that you did to the longest run in the previous month, if you increased that long run distance by between 1 to 10%, there was no statistical increase in injury risk. If you increased that long run by 10 to 30%, the injury risk was significantly higher, right? So if we're having a jump in our long run distance compared to the long run that we've been used to doing, that injury risk was higher. And so we look at it and go, long run distance probably matters, right? We've got to keep an eye on that. Now, do we have to follow that as a recipe? Not necessarily, but we've got to keep an eye on our long run distance and the consistency of it, because there's strong evidence to say that if we're jumping that too high, we might be at risk of injury, right? The other thing to look at is how much are we doing per week and how much are we doing over a fortnight. And everyone's probably heard the 10% per week rule. And actually the evidence maybe doesn't support that strictly. Probably what's the evidence does show is that more than 20% increase per week compared to less than 20% shows a significant increase in injury risk. And if we look at fortnightly, over a 30% increase over a 2-week period, so I mean you could say 15% per week over that, increase the risk of injury. So not hard and fast in terms of the rules there, but probably we've got to keep some look at our weekly load and our fortnightly load to make sure that we're not having huge fluctuations there. And based off this, we'd go somewhere around that 15% per week or over a 2-week period, making sure that we're not jumping too much over that 2-week period would be important to consider. And then the last bit, I don't know if anyone, what's happening there with my controller? Give me a sec. There we go. The last bit is, I don't know if anyone here is training for a marathon or will train for a marathon, but how much we run in our marathon training matters as well. And in particular, there's a huge increase in injury risk for marathon runners that run less than 30 kilometers per week. And that makes sense conceptually. If you're training for a marathon, you need to get some kilometers in. And so we want to making sure that we're, at least in that 30 to 60 kilometers per week range if we're training for a marathon statistically, because the injury risk is likely higher, right? And these are just some studies. There is a lot of them out there, but these are some of the stronger ones that look at injury risk. And so this is what I was saying before. Probably we want to run at least the 30 kilometers to mitigate our injury risk of the running related injury. And so this is a summary of some of the key studies. I'm not going to go through all of them. If anyone wants to take a photo, you can to look through that at a later date. But that's essentially the different load points that may or may not be worth considering in terms of our training load and some of your load considerations. And some people may be more interested in that than not. And that's where probably Dion's job is to keep an eye on some of that stuff, right? The other consideration is, absolutely. No problems at all. And the other consideration, which I think is really important, is underloading, right? Everyone talks about doing too much, but no one often talks about doing too little. And if we're not training enough, we're not going to build the fitness, you're not going to build the capacity to tolerate the things you want to do. And the evidence supports that, right? So it's not only doing too much that's a factor, it's actually doing too little. And, there's different, metrics of measuring that. One of the metrics that they use in sports science is talking about this acute chronic workload ratio, which essentially measures your most recent week to your previous 3 or 4 weeks. And they found that if your most recent week is less than 70% of your previous 3 or 4 weeks, your risk of injury is higher. So just basically trying to make sure that while deload weeks and everything is important, we want to make sure that we're not actually having really big drops. Or if you're doing that, you don't want to have your really big drop and jump straight back to where you were necessarily. And that's where some consideration of, if you get sick, if you go for a holiday and you take time off, you potentially end in a period of being underloaded, which is, that happens in life. That's normal part of a racing calendar or a yearly calendar, but we don't want to jump straight back to where we were necessarily, because the stats say that we'll be susceptible to injury risk. So worthwhile considering. And so let's then come back to our two runners and go, well, Ben and Kevin, these are our Strava graphs for the two runners. We can see a little bit of a difference in our Strava graphs. We can see Ben's a bit all over the place, right? He's put together some good weeks, but Ben's also got some weeks that in there that, the running, maybe he got sick, maybe life was busy, but we can see in his weekly load, when week 1 to 2, there's a 100% increase, big jump, right? And then from week 3 to 4, he's gone down 66%, right? So we're looking at that underloading, but then he jumps straight back up, and that's a 200% increase. And so his load's all over the place, right? Whereas if we compare that to Kevin, and not, we acknowledge that not everyone has the optimal Strava graph, or the load graph, but we can see, 5 to 18% increases, nice consistent increases, and there's a planned deload week in there, which, side note, I'm a big fan of planned deload weeks. And so we can see, much better mapped out training load, right? And then if we go to our long run distance per week, and we talked about that Franston study before that says, all right, maybe we should keep an eye on our long run distance as well as our weekly distance. We can see that here, based off that study, Ben here is done 3 runs in that sort of 6-8 week period, where he's done more than 10% of his previous long run distance increase. Whereas if we compare that to Kevin, it's a much more balanced long run progression, and that 5 to 15% increase. And if we're really picky to the evidence and we go, I said 10%, so there are two runs here with the long run distance that are probably more than that 10% for Kevin, but everyone would probably agree that it looks much more balanced on that the right hand side. And so I think this points to the fact to go, and strengthens people like Dion's platform to go, we probably want some overview of what we're doing with our training, whether you're doing that yourself or getting a coach to help you, right? And so if we then come back to our two runners and go, Ben, we see, has this inconsistent training. We talked about the load spikes before. His load is up and down a bit, right? There's multiple weeks that we're having big jumps. And statistically, we see, not only is he at risk of injury, some studies say up to 64% higher risk of injury because of that. And then we can plan that where we compare that to Kevin, he's got, consistent, let's say he's understanding the nuance in his sessions a little bit better. There's not the big spikes with his training load. And we go, beautiful. What does that tell us? Well, statistically, that well-planned, well-balanced training load, especially with deload weeks in there, not only is his injury risk less, but evidence suggests his performance might be significantly better as well, and potentially up to 9% in some studies, right? So we can go, not only there's the less injury risk, but Kevin might actually run better because of these injury risk factors and the performance factors.